The phone rang for Gabriel Swaggart just after midnight. The air was quiet and the room was dark, the kind of quiet that frequently portends bad news. He heard a family friend's shaky voice as he answered the phone. "Your father, Gabriel? He fell. An ambulance is en route." Time stopped. Gabriel was momentarily out of breath. Reb, his father, the guy who had always been his rock and mentor. At this point, Jimmy Swaggart was struggling to survive. In just a few minutes, Gabrielle was dressed and driving, praying out loud as she went through the deserted streets. "Lord, not yet. Please, not like this," he repeated. Jimmy had already been transferred to the intensive care unit by the time he arrived at the hospital. Physicians suspected something hazardous, something serious, heart problems. Nobody had anticipated this. Jimmy was talking about faith, hope, and strength just hours before as he prepared for another sermon. Gabriel was devastated by the scene as he entered the intensive care unit for the first time. His father was motionless, connected to devices, and his monitors were flickering steadily. Churches were no longer filled with a powerful voice. The Bible was now in cold, still hands that had formerly clutched it with strength. Gabriel stood next to him and held his hand tenderly, hoping that everything would work out. However, worry had already started to seep in. Memories flooded back as he sat next to his father. He recalled his early years spent listening to his father's impassioned lectures while seated in the first row of the church. He recalled their walks together, during which they discussed God, life, and others. He had learned what it meant to believe from his father, even when it appeared like everything was broken. Have faith. Gabriel found himself searching for the same trust today in the antiseptic medical room. Physicians came and went. The updates were not clear. "He is critical but stable. We're keeping a careful eye on him." Gabriel felt powerless. He was determined to do whatever it took to get his father back. He conversed with him, read him poetry, and related tales from their history. Even though he was unable to answer, he prayed his father could hear. Gabriel sat by the bed that night and started to sing when a nurse who saw his suffering whispered softly, "Sometimes they can hear more than we think." It was a quiet, gentle, and profound song that had long been a favorite of his father's. He was so overcome by passion that his voice broke halfway through. Then something occurred. Jimmy's fingers moved, twitched slightly. A change was picked up by the cardiac monitor. It was something, but not much. Gabriel paused and raised his gaze to the nurse. She nodded and smiled slightly. "Continue singing." Hope reappeared in that precarious instant. Gabriel stayed with his father for the next 2 days. He spoke, he wept, he sung, he pleaded. He also poured his heart out in a letter that he hoped to read to his father when he awoke. It was honest and unvarnished, full of love and suffering. It contained all of the things he had never spoken out to his father. "Thank you," he said. He pardoned him. He also begged for pardon. Gabriel read that letter out loud beside Jimmy on the third day. Each word he spoke felt heavier than the last, and his voice was low and full of emotion. It was a simple line in the end. "I'm honored to be your son, no matter what." After giving his father a forehead kiss, he left the intensive care unit. He let himself breathe for the first time in days. Gabriel shared a brief video with his followers later that night, but it was a lesson rather than a medical update. No matter how strong you think you are, there will come a time when only faith can carry you through, he added. Life is fragile. One moment you're praying for a second chance, and the next you're planning for tomorrow. I still don't know what tomorrow holds, but I know God is with us in the fear, in the pain, and in the waiting. This isn't about health updates anymore. It's about knowing what really matters, he added. My father always said that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting even when you don't. People from all over the world sent messages, sharing their own ICU stories, their own struggles, and how Gabriel's words helped them feel better. Back at the hospital, Jimmy Swaggart was still being closely watched, showing signs of improvement, but no one knew for sure what would happen next. Despite this, Gabriel felt a sense of peace that comes from surrender rather than answers. Gabriel's final message to viewers as the story came to a close was, "If you're going through something right now, I want you to know you're not alone. I experienced the fear, helplessness, hope, and love, and I've learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be there and believe." His son, Gabriel, was upstairs in his study doing some ministry work when he heard a loud thud. The family had just finished lunch, and Reverend Jimmy Swaggart was sitting in his favorite armchair, leafing through an old Bible with handwritten notes in the margins, looking calm, almost reflective, as if he were deep in thought. perhaps preparing mentally for next week's sermon. For a few terrifying seconds, Gabriel froze, not sure if what he was seeing was real, but instinct took over. "Dad, Dad, can you hear me?" he yelled, his voice shaking as he gently tried to support his father's head. Startled, he hurried downstairs, his heart pounding, and saw his father slumped in the chair, head tilted, eyes barely open, struggling to breathe. Breathing was shallow and strained, but there was no answer. Gabriel's hands were shaking so severely that he could hardly grip the phone as he hurriedly contacted emergency services. While the ambulance drove away, the operator calmly led him step by step. Gabriel found it difficult to believe what was taking place. Only a few moments before, his father appeared to be in wonderful health, laughing and discussing the message of optimism. He was now fading just in front of him. The paramedics showed up in a matter of minutes. The house's walls were urgently painted by the red lights that flashed outside. They started giving Jimmy oxygen right away, monitoring his vitals, and getting ready to take him to the closest hospital. Gabriel stared at his father's pallid face while he sat quietly in the back of the ambulance. It all blurred in the hospital as he continued to implore, "Hold on, Dad, please hold on." Medical staff yelling out terms Gabriel didn't understand, doors flinging open, nurses hurrying. His father waited outside, powerless, like a child again, while they carted him away toward the intensive care unit. The wait felt like it would last forever, and the hospital hallway was chilly than any winter night. Gabriel was immediately told by the doctors that Jimmy had experienced a severe heart crisis, a silent illness that had been growing over time without any obvious symptoms. His heart had abruptly weakened. Gabriel was unable to comprehend it. His father had always possessed both physical and spiritual strength. It was so awful to think that he was lying there, weak and unresponsive. Everyone hurried to the hospital as word got out to the rest of the outreach team and family. People from all around the world called. Prayers and messages of strength and hope are sent by friends, pastors, and followers. However, nothing was able to relieve Gabriel's chest pain. This was more than just a well-known person in dire straits. This was the guy who had influenced his life, his father, his mentor. Gabriel sat silently in the waiting area, gazing at the floor while mentally reliving the entire day. The ride in the ambulance, the unexpected fall, and the lunchtime laughing. Everything had happened far too quickly. Their entire world had been upended in a single day. Thus started the most difficult trip Gabriel had ever experienced, both as a man of religion and as a son. One thought kept coming back to him as he waited outside the intensive care unit, not knowing what the following hour would hold. Life doesn't always warn you. It simply changes in an instant. With a gentle hiss, the ICU door opened. However, it sounded like a thunderclap to Gabriel. The chilly air enveloped him like a layer of ice as he entered. The room was filled with the sterile scent of disinfectant, pharmaceuticals, and silent misery. In the background, machines beeped softly, their pattern constant but eerie. It seemed as though the room itself was holding its breath. Even yet, everything in it was intended to keep people alive. Gabriel's heart was heavy as he moved slowly to his father's bedside. With a thin hospital sheet covering his body, Reverend Jimmy Swaggart lay there unmoving and colorless. His arms were tubed, a heart monitor pulsed in the corner, and oxygen passed through a mask over his mouth. Every beat on the screen demonstrated how fleeting life really was. His father had never looked like this to Gabriel. The man who used to stand so proudly at the pulpit was now lying in silence, engaged in a conflict he was unable to discuss. He extended his hand and took his father's hand tenderly. It was softer than he remembered and frigid. Gabriel's eyes briefly began to well up with tears, but he forced himself to suppress them. He was trying not to cry. Not in this place. Not quite yet. Although the nurses had informed him that patients in this state would not reply, he spoke to him in a whisper, saying, "Dad, I'm here. You're not alone." A kind person had said, "He might hear you," so Gabriel spoke. He told him everything, including how the family had been praying when they first got to the hospital, how the church was filled with people holding hands and lighting candles while they waited for good news, and how much he needed and loved him. For some time, he sat in silence, listening to the machines, watching his father's chest rise and fall, counting each breath as if it were a precious gem, and his thoughts drifted back to the good old days when he sat with his father in the early morning hours, sipping coffee and talking about the Bible, and how his eyes would light up when he talked about faith. That same man lay powerless, And Gabriel pondered, where was that strength now? How firmly he believed that God could heal, restore, and transform. However, something inside Gabriel stirred even at that broken moment, and the silence. This was the fight, the silent conflict, and it was being fought with every heartbeat. Hours went by, but Gabriel remained by the bedside, occasionally talking, occasionally singing softly, and occasionally just sitting, watching, praying, and hoping. Doctors checked the monitors, nurses came and went, and Jimmy didn't wake up, but Gabriel felt, if only slightly, that his father could sense him there. "Dad, do you remember what you always told me?" Gabriel asked, leaning closer as the night became darker and the outside world grew quiet. That waiting, rather than the miracle, is what proves that faith. The silence in the ICU felt less oppressive after that. "Well, I'm waiting and I'm still believing." Gabriel sat near the intensive care unit, his mind caught between hope and fear, and every time a doctor passed by, he straightened in his chair, silently pleading for some good news. It felt sacred, like a battlefield where prayers, memories, and love stood guard over a life hanging in the balance. The hours stretched into days, and the waiting got heavier with each moment. The responses, however, were consistently the same: uncertain, cautious, clinical. "He's still critical. We're watching him closely. No major change yet." These words echoed in his ears like echoes in a room without people, and Gabriel felt emotionally torn in 100 different directions at one point. At another, he felt strong, filled with prayer and faith. The next day he was tired, afraid, and doubtful. He hadn't slept well for days. His eyes were red, his voice was raspy, and his heart felt like it had been overworked. He couldn't stop wondering why. "God, why now? Why, my father? Why like this?" And even though he had spent his entire life preaching about trusting God's timing, this was different. It was personal. He tried to remain strong for his family, the ministry, and the people praying around the world, but on the inside, he was breaking. There were times when he looked at the ceiling and questioned whether he had the strength to continue. Gabriel sobbed in the quiet areas of the hospital where no one could hear him. He entered the small, dimly lit, and empty hospital chapel one night because he could no longer stand the silence. He sat down in the back row and finally let everything out. No fancy prayers, no filters, just a broken son speaking to his God. "I don't know what you're doing, Lord," he whispered, "but now more than ever, I need you." At the moment, I am not a pastor. I am merely his boy. Sometimes the loudest faith is the one that whispers, "I'm still here," even when your heart is drowning. He recalled something his father had told him as he sat there slumped over with his face in his hands. "You may not see it," a nurse told to Gabriel later that evening, "but your father's body is still fighting." That notion gave him just enough strength to get back up and head back to the intensive care unit. Perhaps your voice, your presence, and your love are what are keeping him going. It felt like riding an emotional roller coaster while blindfolded, with no idea of what would happen next. Whether the drop was around the corner or the ride was gradually coming to an end, those words didn't promise healing, but they gave Gabriel a reason to hope again. Every little moment, a flicker on the monitor, a slight change in breathing, a subtle movement of the fingers became a reason to believe. 3 days had gone by since Jimmy Swaggart was admitted to the intensive care unit, but Gabriel stayed through it all because he loved his father, because he had faith, even if it was shaken, and because he had a deep-seated sense that his presence mattered, that his father could hear and feel him, and perhaps, just possibly, that he was holding on because of it. Even though there were indications of stability, the uncertainty remained a shadow. However, something inside Gabriel had changed. He had prayed, cried, waited, and now he was ready to speak. That evening, as the sun started to set and painted the sky with shades of hope and sorrow, Gabriel's heart never settled. The hospital lights never dimmed, and the beeping machines never stopped. With weary eyes and a trembling voice, Gabriel walked outside the hospital and sat on a bench by himself. He opened his phone, turned on the camera, and hit record. "I spent the last few days in a place I never thought I'd be, watching my father, my hero, lying in a hospital bed, connected to machines, completely silent," he said, his voice shaky and his eyes tired. "You can't prepare for that kind of pain." I didn't intend to say anything in public at the moment, but I feel like someone out there needs to hear this, because I've learned something in these long nights of waiting and these hours of silence that I could never have learned anywhere else. You think you're strong until you're the one who has to be, he said, pausing, as if every word were being drawn from somewhere deep inside. Gabriel gazed into the lens with heavy but sincere eyes. Life is fleeting. We continue to plan, preach, dream, and believe we have time. But in reality, everything could change in the blink of an eye. I never imagined seeing my father in this state, and I have no idea what the future holds. But I do know this much. He talked about the nurses and how they treated Jimmy like family, as well as the little things that had a big impact on him, like a hospital staff member leaving a letter that said, "We're praying with you." Faith isn't about having answers, it's about trusting when there are none. He bent his head and said softly, "I've been a preacher's son all my life," or a stranger recognizing him and saying, "We're standing in faith with your family." I've heard that God can heal people. Nothing compares to the unadulterated, agonizing beauty of requiring a miracle, even if I've preached about them. Gabriel straightened up a little in desperation and gained strength. He went on, "I want to say something to everyone who is listening, especially those who are now going through a difficult time. I've discovered that faith isn't always loud. It doesn't always appear to be confidence. Sometimes all it takes is to sit next to someone you care about, grasp their hand, and say in a whisper, 'I'm here, I still think so.'" He used his jacket sleeve to dab at his eyes. He didn't break, even though the camera briefly captured the full force of his emotions. He remained calm. "I want you to know that you're not alone if you're watching this and you're in pain, if a loved one is ill, or if you're afraid of what might happen next. It's a heavy moment right now. However, God remains there in the waiting, in the heartache, and in the space where dread and hope converge." In a single phrase that was taken directly from his heart, he concluded the video. "Regardless of what transpires, I am certain that he and my father heard me." He paused the video and sat quietly while the evening wind blew across his face. There was no press release. There was no media update. His heart was opened by the sun, touching hundreds of people in the process. The video had gone widespread in religious communities by dusk. From all throughout the world, messages flooded in. Mothers, young people, pastors, believers, and even those who did not follow the ministry. Everyone was touched by Gabriel's bravery and honesty. A miraculous report was not required. He provided them with the truth they needed, the type that unites people in their common suffering and hope. Gabriel Swaggart sat at the window, gazing into the dark night as the hospital lights flickered softly above the intensive care unit hallway. 3 days had gone by since his father was in, and while the doctors reported some minor progress, nothing was certain. The eyes of Reverend Jimmy Swaggart were still closed. Even though nothing significant had changed, something felt off. Neither the monitors nor the reports mentioned it. Gabriel had the desire. Fear no longer paralyzed him. Rather, a silent calm enveloped him, a peace based on faith rather than facts or results. There was only the constant sound of the heart monitor, the rhythm of breath through the ventilator, and the quiet hum of hope. No miraculous headline, no abrupt recovery, no dramatic moment of healing. Gabriel had leaned over and whispered one more message in his father's earlier that day. He expressed all of his suppressed feelings in a calm voice. "I want you to know that I'm all right, and that you don't need to worry about us, Dad. If you can hear me, we're going to carry you after you've carried this family for so long. With love, strength, and the same faith you instilled in us, we will uphold your name, legacy, and mission." For hours thereafter, he sat by his father's bedside, observing his breathing and recalling each occasion that had influenced his life. Recalling Jimmy's powerful voice and his grasp on the stage when delivering passionate sermons, he smiled quietly.